If you define success as being able to change the other person's mind or the other person's behavior, you are setting yourself up for resentment and more conflict. Change the measure of success to something that you have control over. When I point a finger at somebody else, you can see this on the screen, there are 3 fingers pointing back at me. I'm the one that I gotta change. I can't change somebody else's attitudes or behaviors. Ultimately, that's up to them.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Hey friends, one of the main reasons I started this podcast was that I thought connecting with people we don't always agree with, and especially as it relates to this election, is super important, but it's also really challenging. How do we connect with people across party lines, talk about politics, but also just be in relationship with them when we have pretty strong disagreements? So this episode is specifically addressing that. So you will notice that we are having this conversation with an expert in having hard conversations after I shared an episode with you where I had a very hard conversation. Craig, for reference, the last episode, I was talking to my uncle who has very different politics than I do. So we showed an example of what it looks like before we get the expert's opinion. So Craig Freshley is here today with us, who is an expert in group facilitation and communication and conflict. I found out about Craig because someone clued me into a regular meeting that he hosted, started in 2017, called Makeshift Coffee House, in which he specifically brought together Republicans and Democrats to be in conversation with one another. They are not currently running, but he is sharing his wisdom with us here today. Let me introduce you to Craig formally. So Craig Freshley is a professional meeting facilitator, speaker, and author with an inspiring attitude and a well-earned reputation for helping groups be efficient, harmonious, and productive. In 2022, Craig's 3rd book was published, Together We Decide, an essential guide for making good group decisions. In 2019, Craig won the American Civic Collaboration Award for creating and facilitating makeshift coffee houses, as I just mentioned, face-to-face places where Democrats and Republicans met to talk and understand each other's political views. He has also written and produced hundreds of one-page good group tips and how-to videos that he makes freely available to subscribers and followers. And I will link to that in the show notes and resources on the webpage. He offers a free online training talk show every month and has developed 3 online self-paced e-learning courses. So he has a lot of resources for you. Craig has professionally facilitated over 3,000 meetings where he has helped groups make good decisions. Craig works with a wide variety of clients, including governments, nonprofits, and businesses of all sizes and in all sectors. True to Craig's values, Craig's company gives 1% of all gross revenue to charity. He lives with his wife in a co-housing community. I love that. And Craig is a Quaker, a Swiftie, and a closet ukulele player. And there's a ukulele behind you, which I love. So not so closeted, Craig. I love it. You can learn so much more about Craig at goodgroupdecisions.com. And I will link everything that he shares in the show notes so you can easily find it. So Craig, thank you. What an introduction and what a guest. I am so excited for you to be here with us today.
Well, thanks, Devin. I hope you don't ask me too many questions about Taylor Swift or the ukulele, but yeah, here I am.
Here you are. I will not, I promise. Okay. So getting to know you a little bit, Craig, can you explain a bit about your background and how you ended up where you are facilitating group meetings, helping people make group decisions and enhancing group connection?
Well, I have always been fascinated with how we as humans make decisions in groups. I studied political science and philosophy in college. I went on to get a master's degree in public policy. I worked for the state government. I worked for the Maine State Planning Office. I've just been fascinated and concerned. I'm also an environmentalist and a social justice advocate, and I have fears about the future of our world. And I've thought to myself, we got to do better. There must be better ways to connect with each other and make decisions in groups. So I've made a career out of studying and teaching that.
Got it. Fantastic. We love that. Well, thank goodness for you because you have helped a lot of people thus far. So in addition to your professional background, you mentioned that you're a Quaker in your bio, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. And I think it's really relevant to what you do and who you are and how you show up and what you care about and value. So your spiritual path is relevant as a Quaker. Can you explain briefly for listeners what it means that you are a Quaker, what Quakerism is, and how it relates to the work that you do and what we'll talk about here today?
Well, there's a saying that if you ask 10 Quakers what it means to be a Quaker, you will get 10 different answers. There is, I think, a fundamental value among all Quakers, and that is some version of there's that of God in every person. Sometimes we refer to it as the light within. But the basic idea is that we each have God within us. No one has a more direct connection to the divine than anyone else. And you can see that as a meeting facilitator, that belief carries very much into my professional work. When I work with a group of people, I'm looking for the good in every person. I'm looking for the gifts that each person has to contribute. I don't see one person, regardless of what they look like or what they've been through or who they are, I don't see one person as more important or superior to another person. And these are right in line with Quaker values. And by the way, it's not that I was a Quaker and then I found the profession of meeting facilitation. It was the other way around. I'm what's known as a convinced Quaker, not a birthright Quaker. I was not born into the faith. I came to it quite a bit later in life because the whole idea of Quakerism shares my values. That's why I'm a Quaker.
I love that. And so can you share for people, because I think for me, I love the idea of God being within us and nobody has more access to God than anybody else, which is very different than many of the patriarchal and hierarchical religions that exist. And I think it's really helpful for people to understand what happens in a Quaker meeting. And the sort of general structure. I actually have done quite a few funerals that are Quaker meeting style funerals, and they are incredibly impactful and really beautiful. And it comes up in weddings sometimes as well. And so I've learned some and have attended a couple of meetings, but I think it really helps people to understand what exactly happens in a Quaker meeting. And for those of you listening, if you don't know what a Quaker meeting is, it's basically the idea, it's the relevant idea in the Quaker tradition of church where you get together as a community, but it's definitely different than a church service. And so could you explain, Craig, just loosely what happens at a Quaker meeting?
Well, here too, there are different formats
Yes.
for different Quaker meetings. When most people think of a Quaker meeting, they think of silence, sitting in silence. Sometimes we call it waiting worship. And we are all listening for what does God have to say? And by the way, Quaker allows that people can think of God in many different ways. There is not a prescription for how an attender at a Quaker meeting needs to think of God. In fact, a common Quaker principle is that we have no oaths, no creeds, no allegiances. You are allowed to think of God however you want. But however you think of God, we are sitting together in silence, listening. The question is something like, what does God want me to do? What does God want our meeting to do? And in this vein, no one's in charge of a Quaker meeting. There often isn't even a front of the room, or in many Quaker meetings, there isn't a designated person leading us through a program. God's in charge. And we all have equal access to God, and you just kind of sit there in silence and wait to see what happens.
Which I love. I love that is, I think, so profound. The idea of waiting and listening, and then if someone feels called to share, it also elicits a sense of self-trust. And I think that especially in our society now, there's so much not active listening that happens where you're having a conversation. And I think especially in these conversations that you and I are talking about today, where you don't agree with someone and your nervous system is elevated and you might be heated or you might be upset or whatever it is, it's really hard to listen and be present and not be reactive, and also not be thinking while someone is talking, how am I going to respond to this? It's not about response in Quaker meetings necessarily. It's about what is being called to move through you, as opposed to what is your mind wanting to bring forward into a situation, which is so beautiful. So, yeah.
Well, thanks. That's well said. And I think it's beautiful too.
Yeah. Okay. So you're here because we want to talk about how to have conversations, let's say across the aisle, difficult conversations. And can you speak a bit to why this matters? You started, this coffee house, like you've made a point to really be a part of people having conversations with the other side of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. And in your mind, what is the value of connecting across those divides? And to that point, what happens when those connections are broken? Which is why we need to help them.
Well, when connections are broken, we find ourselves at war. When connections are enhanced, we find ourselves at peace. I'm sure that's oversimplistic, but I have been concerned that people in our country seem to be moving in the direction of less connection rather than more connection. We have seen the parties, the Democratic and Republican Party, get more ideologically apart. Not only that, though, we have seen people be increasingly mean to each other, say and do disrespectful things to each other just because another person shares a different point of view. And that's troubling to me, because that moves us in the direction of conflict rather than in the direction of peace. I would like to see us move in the direction of peace. And I have this kind of crazy idea that we can get along with each other in peaceful ways, even when we disagree. And I think there's a disturbing trend that says, just because I disagree with you on this, or just because you're a different party than me, or just because your skin is a different color, or you come from a different world than me, I don't want to work with you.
Right.
I have decided that you have nothing to offer, and I'm going to alienate myself from you just because we see differently. And I think that's profoundly wrong. I think that we make a strong and peaceful society by embracing our differences and trying to work together anyway. We have a lot more in common than we have different. And the one big thing we have in common is the future of Mother Earth. And if we have any hope of saving our species from extinction, or at least having a good quality life, we've got to find ways to work together in spite of our disagreements.
Yeah, I agree. And Craig, I really appreciate you talking about how disconnection leads to more conflict and connection leads to peace. I've built I don't even call it my work, my purpose and my passion and my calling, and has been, and I did not build it, it came to me, and I feel very called to it, is around connection. And that healing connection and enhancing connection is our healing path forward towards peace. And I don't think it's crazy what you're doing. But if it is, we can be crazy together.
Okay, let's be crazy together. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So one of the things that came up when I was having this conversation with my uncle last week was that, for me, I think it helps so much in these situations to redefine success a little bit. I think a lot of times in these conversations across the aisle, especially when we're passionate about an issue or our beliefs or our values, we can want to change someone's opinion, right? We can want to, convince someone or to argue about it or be like, you're wrong and I'm right. And for me, I think one of the things that I can potentially contribute to this conversation in terms of knowledge is that connection comes from curiosity. It doesn't come from judgment. And so the whole Ted Lasso quote, "Be curious, not judgmental," is constantly present in this podcast and in my life and many's. But I also think that it's about, I had this thing come to me as I was sort of preparing for this conversation with my uncle, just like mentally and physically. And I thought, don't try to correct, just try to connect. And so it's about connecting, not correcting. And I think sometimes bringing that correction energy cuts off connection because it's like, I know better than you do, which then makes people feel not great. And that leads to disconnection. So that's my sort of like tip or trick or sort of idea. But I know that you have a lot of knowledge in this arena. So what are some tips and tricks that you recommend for people having conversations across divides, these tough conversations?
Well, first of all, I value everything that you said, and I think that's all true. And I love the phrase, don't correct, just connect. Number one, if you define success as being able to change the other person's mind or the other person's behavior, you are setting yourself up for resentment and more conflict. Change the measure of success to something that you have control over. When I point a finger at somebody else, you can see this on the screen, there are 3 fingers pointing back at me. I'm the one that I got to change. I can't change somebody else's attitudes or behaviors. Ultimately, that's up to them, but I can change mine. And so I think that a better definition of success is me feeling more at peace about my attitudes and my behaviors. At least that's something that I have control over. I'll name 3 things, I guess. So be careful how you define success and put that on you and not on the other person. Number 2 is, maybe it's very related to number 1, but lower your expectations. Have you ever heard the phrase, expectations are planned resentments? And when I expect that a certain thing is going to happen, there too, I'm setting myself up for disappointment. And we could argue that this is another wonderful thing about the Quaker way of doing things, is that we let go of expectations. Here's another phrase: God laughs at plans.
Yeah. Or God or life is what happens to your plans. Yeah.
Yeah. Life is what happens to you. I'm not in charge. I'm in charge of me. And that's as far as it goes. And number 3, I want to highlight what you said about curiosity. Just be curious and don't have any expectation beyond that. I'm just going to learn from my uncle what I can. This is a precious opportunity to not try to persuade him to think differently, but to learn why he thinks the way he does. Here's another catchphrase. I can be curious about your beliefs without needing to change my beliefs. I don't need to be threatened. I'm okay with asking you lots of questions about why you believe what you believe. And while you answer me, I'm going to nod and smile and validate that and think to myself, yeah, if I was raised that way with that education and those values, I'd think that way too. And maybe this is a 4th thing is, try to have compassion for how and why the other person believes what they do. I'm going to throw another one at you. I'm sorry about this, but
it's okay.
Here it comes. Every person has a good reason for what they believe. My gosh, I have to remember that. I may not agree with your belief. I may not like it. I may think it's destructive and harmful to others, but there's something going on with you that makes you believe that. And if I just discredit that belief out of hand, you're going to take that personally. It is a challenge to your identity. You're going to withdraw, and either we're not going to talk to each other at all or we're going to be in conflict. If I want to connect with somebody, I have to honor that principle that regardless of how your belief lands with me, I understand that you have a good reason for believing it.
Right. Yeah. And I think I know there's a catchphrase that goes along with this, but I don't remember it. So I'm just going to explain the concept. Which is that a lot of times we'll look at people and be like, why are you this way? Right. But it's like, or like, how can you be this way? Or how can you believe this? But instead it's like, why are you this way? It's changing the intonation of that question. What has happened in your life? Or what are the things that have contributed to this? Or, what are some of the factors? And so being curious and understanding someone as a human and connecting with them about their life experience and even considering that they have life experience instead of just being someone with beliefs that you don't believe. Having compassion, I think, is so great. I love that you've shared that. Yeah.
And a related strategy is try to connect with somebody not about the thing on which you disagree. Find other things to do together, other ways to connect, strengthen the relationship first, and then it's easier to connect even about the thing you disagree on.
So start with a foundation of common ground as opposed to uncommon ground.
Yeah, whatever you have in common. You both like sports. If you and your uncle like sports, watch sports together or go to a sports game. So it takes investment. Relationships take investment. We can't expect instant connection. And again, it's back to me. I have to make the investment. I'm the one that has to reach across the aisle and say, hey, how about we go to a Red Sox game? Or how about we do this or that? Pick your thing. Don't expect the other person to initiate that. Don't be angry at the other person for not initiating that. Initiate it.
Right. And have the hard conversation. Yeah. And you said something that I want to sort of check in on again before we move forward, which was the first point about setting your expectations and having your expectations be about you and not about the other person. Right. Can you give like a couple of examples of that, Craig? Because I think that's really interesting. Because for me, the intention is to connect with the person and to understand them better. That's that was my intention with chatting with my uncle, was like, I want to understand this person who has very different experience, very different beliefs very different news, which we will talk about in a little bit, and understand them better. But what I'm wondering is if you're saying like, okay, do I have the intention of remaining compassionate or sharing my own, like what would an example be of a definition of success or like an intention that someone could have that would be authentic and also aligned in terms of this, have it be about yourself and not about the other person?
Well, you just gave a very good example. The intention of simply wanting to understand the person better.
Okay.
I want to understand my uncle better. That's on me.
Got it.
I want
that's
to
about me. Okay.
Yeah,
got it.
You see, you gave a good example there, Devin. That's an example of where I'm in control of that. Mm-hmm. I want to feel more at ease when I interact with this person. That's my expectation, or even a better word, as you've introduced, is intention. Yeah, that's my intention. Mm-hmm. I want to feel better whenever I interact with this person. I want to help this person with their challenges. If somebody is acting out in disrespectful, aggressive ways, chances are they are in some kind of pain. There's something going on with them that is causing them to, quote, behave badly. And maybe my intention is to show some compassion and give to that person in some way that will help them. Not be too prescriptive, not force anything, but come into the conversation with an intention of giving rather than getting. What can I give to this person that is going to help them feel more at peace? That type of thing, I think, works better than, oh man, I'm going to show them, or I just got to make this person see that they're dumb. Those are not good intentions.
Right. And I think, they're not good intentions, but there's a nuance in there that I want to be really specific about. And I actually think it's a good segue, which is I want to give someone something to help them with this challenge, or, to help them understand, or whatever it is. That also can skew sometimes, if you were looking at it in a specific way, as arrogant. Like, I'm going to give you the understanding that you need to see things clearly. Right. And so this goes to the sort of idea of like mindset, and like this idea of being curious but not judgmental. But vulnerability is what leads to connection. That's scientifically proven. Thank you, Brene Brown, right? But vulnerability is super hard in these conversations when you feel like on guard, or you feel like even you could be unsafe. And we know that when people are defensive or feel attacked, they then go on the attack.
Right.
And so in those situations, how does mindset and attitude play out across the divides? And like, how can people make sure that they're not doing that as much as possible? Like, what are some ways to think about mindset and attitude that might help them in not creating more conflict, but maybe more connection and peace and understanding?
Right. Okay. Here is a really helpful mindset and attitude. I don't know what's right for you. And I've heard Quakers say that to me many, many times. In general, Quakers don't tell you what to do. Don't tell you what to believe.
How lovely.
Don't tell you how you should behave. We don't have oaths or creeds or allegiance. We have examples. We call them testimonies. We have questions. We call them queries. Here's a question you might consider. Here's an example. Well, in my experience, I've seen this, but I don't know what's right for you. I have not walked in your shoes. I do not have the background and the constitution that you have. We are different personality types. We were raised in different ways. We were dealt different cards. So it is not okay for me to presume to know what's right for you. And, back to your calling out the phrase give, I want to give something to the other person. We don't want to come across as patronizing or knowing what's best. So maybe we change the word to offer, and you take it up if you want to. But if you don't want to take up what I have to offer, I'm not going to be judgmental about that because I don't know what's right for you.
Right. But I do love that what you just described almost could be like a filter, right? So like, are you offering something up that is in the, I don't know what's best for you, right? In that realm and has that sort of vibe to it? Or is it coming at it from a place of, I do know what's right for you? And that is a good filter to decide if it is an offering or if it is something else that's maybe not as constructive. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I want to point out that this principle, I don't know what's right for you, applies to relationships where we are equals and where we're probably grown-ups. You know, a parent speaking to a child, you know, actually, I do know what's right for you. Don't touch the wood stove. Yeah, you know, there are occasions.
Yes.
And sometimes there are best friends, you know, when the friend says to the other friend, look, man, I've known you a long time.
Right.
And, you know, slap, slap, slap. Get a grip, man. I know what's right for you. Don't keep dating this girl, you know. And in close relationships, we give each other permission to play that role sometimes.
Correct.
But that friend, I might, you know, slap, slap, slap. Don't do this, but I'm going to love them anyway.
Right.
And the same thing with a parent-child. You know, don't touch the friggin' wood stove, but I'm going to love you anyway, no matter what you do. And when you have that super high level of connection and love, you know, it's different. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And there's a built-in framework of understanding and knowing each other and loving each other. And there may be love in other situations, but not that same level of safety. That I think is inherent in the relationships that you're talking about, where vulnerability is much more free-flowing. Obviously, vulnerability is not easy for everybody or anybody all the time, but, you know, it's a very different dynamic when you're having a conversation like the ones that we're primarily talking about, which is with people who have very different beliefs than us, namely between Democrats and Republicans.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so, you know, I really want us to cover something that is very challenging in this situation, which is that it seems like, and I ran into this with my uncle, and it was no surprise to me. And it feels almost like the biggest barrier in these conversations is that the two sides, myself and my uncle, for example, have very different versions of the truth. Like incredibly different news that we're seeing, incredibly different spins and perspectives on things. Like so vastly different. And they're technically not exactly misinformation and disinformation. We are having some guests on the show in a couple weeks to talk about misinformation and disinformation. But like fake news, quote unquote, really it's like spins on facts are so different. How do we deal with that in these conversations? Because I don't know how to deal with it. And it's so complicated. Like, your truth is so different than my truth, not just in terms of what we believe, but in terms of what you think is factual about these people or about situations that are happening. So how do you deal with that, Craig?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I was taught probably in a high school debating class or something a long time ago that if you're in a disagreement with somebody, at least agree on the facts first. If we can't agree on the facts, we can't go forward. And I think that's a principle that many people carry with them today. I can't go forward with you. I can't get along with you if we don't agree on the facts first. And so what tends to happen is at the start of a conversation, different facts are revealed, and we find ourselves in a disagreement about what's true and what's not true. And we can't get out of that disagreement and move forward to the step of actually working together to make a better future, whatever that looks like. In the case of an uncle, the better future might be nicer Thanksgiving dinners, you know, or whatever. However, I have changed my views on that, and I have come to use a strategy that says, okay, you believe in different facts than I do. Let's assume then, and let's just go forward with the framework that that's true for you and this is true for me. And if that's true for you and if this is true for me, how can we get along and go to baseball games and have Thanksgiving dinners and do stuff together, be in a connected relationship with each other in spite of our different view of the facts. Related to that is the strategy which we often call speak for yourself or use I statements. I get that you think climate change is not a problem and not caused by people. In my experience, and according to the things that I have read and studied, I think that climate change is caused by people and is life-threatening. I'm simply speaking for myself and stating my beliefs. I believe that there can be multiple truths. In fact, we know this.
That's the world we live in. It's all the truths.
World. Yeah. It's the world. It's actually the world we've always lived in. How you see things and what you believe depends on where you sit. And we all sit in different places and see things differently. And this notion of trying to arrive at a single universal truth, I think, is flawed. And I'm going to indict many religions on this count because there are many religions of the world that insist upon belief on a single universal truth. And it is a setup for war, oppression, conflict. It is the excuse that one group of people uses to oppress another group of people that they know the universal truth. So can we just throw out that idea that there is a universal truth and accommodate multiple truths?
Right. That is exactly what interfaith and interspirituality is. And it's why I believe I was called to seminary, because it was like, this is causing so much conflict and so much disconnection. And what if people could understand that? What if it's all the same thing, which is what interspirituality really talks about. But also, what if we could respect and value and see people as equally valuable who have different beliefs? And that's fine. And it's not one way. And I completely agree. Anyways, I could get on a soapbox for hours about that. But yes, I agree. And I appreciate you bringing that up, Craig, because it is a really important factor in this idea of like coming to one truth, right?
I do, if I may, want to offer a limit. You know, I can be okay with you believing whatever you want to believe as long as you don't use that belief to oppress or harm others.
Yes. Cause no harm. Cause no harm.
That is the limit. I'm willing to let you believe and live your life in ways that work for you, between you and your God.
Right.
But it is not okay for you to use those beliefs as justification to cause harm.
100%. And it is not okay for you to feel that it is okay to try to convince anybody else of your beliefs.
Yeah,
like that, I do not believe in proselytizing either. So yeah, I agree. It's between you and your God. And if you do no harm, then that is what matters, right? But there is so much harm being done in religion. And hopefully that will shift. That's part of the hope of what I'm doing as well. So we'll see. If I can take a little chunk out of that, I will be successful. So I am curious, Craig, because you ran these coffee houses in person and then you moved to an online model. And so tell me a little bit about these meetings and how they went. So for reference, everybody, I found out about Craig because when I first announced that I was doing this podcast, a client who I had met with and done one soul support session, this 90-minute session, years ago, sent me a message. She's on my newsletter list, and she sent me an email, and she said, please find Craig Freshley because he did this incredible coffee house. It was so amazing. He was incredible and such a great group facilitator, but it was specifically about having conversation across the border of these barriers. And so, I mean, clearly these were very impactful. I had not known about them. I wish I had, or I would have been at every single one of them. So tell us a little bit about those meetings and some of what you experienced and witnessed in those meetings.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for asking about that. The meetings were based on the premise that Democrats and Republicans, I'm being too general here and categorical, but we're misunderstanding each other. And, you know, at the time, Donald Trump was running against Hillary Clinton. And, you know, the Democrats were thinking, how can you vote for that guy? And Republicans were thinking, how can you vote for that woman? And so I said, well, let's get together and ask the question. Let's ask the Republicans to explain to the Democrats in the room what they see in Donald Trump, why he speaks to them, and why they are moved to vote for him and support him. Let's understand. And similarly, you know, the other way, it's a chance for Republicans to understand. The coffee houses had a singular purpose, and that is to understand each other's political beliefs. Not to persuade, not to decide which beliefs are right, not to try to flip votes or anything, but simply to understand each other's political beliefs. And so each one had a topic. What does it mean to be patriotic, for instance, might be a topic. Or we had 2 or 3 of them on the topic of guns. And we asked people to speak up. Why is gun ownership so important to you? And I would ask that person to tell their reason. And then I would ask them, where did you get those beliefs? Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your education. Tell me about your experiences. And we heard stories of a person who was raised in a certain neighborhood outside of Baltimore. And for that person, carrying a gun provided a great deal of personal safety. And we heard other reasons about being raised in a hunting culture and all kinds of good reasons. Each person has a good reason for what they believe. We were able to hear these reasons. And on the other side, I would ask somebody, why is gun control so important to you? And we heard stories of people being afraid of mass shootings but simply hearing the stories helped us understand why a person could come to those beliefs. You can leave the meeting then and use your understanding of those stories to come up with advocacy strategies and campaign strategies to beat the other side. I don't mind conflict in a controlled, prescribed, agreed to way. We have campaigns. We elect our favorite people. Our society is set up in many ways to argue against each other, and may the best argument win. I'm not opposed to that if it's done with civility and respect and without oppression or destruction. But that was not the purpose of the meeting. The purpose of these meetings was simply to understand. If you want to fight, do that in another arena. This arena is for understanding. And by having that as the singular purpose, it helped people come to the table. It became non-threatening. Many people don't want to go to a meeting that's going to erupt in an argument or worse, but they will come to a meeting where they know there's going to be a skilled moderator simply helping people to understand each other. So that was kind of the whole thing.
There's something that I'm realizing as you're talking about this, Craig, which I think is actually really helpful for me to hear and understand, but also I hope our listeners might also benefit from it, which is the idea that you chose one topic at a time, right? So for me, I had this conversation with my uncle and I covered all of the topics. Like we went into all of it, right? Because that was the point, was to have a conversation to really understand where we're coming from and the big issues. And it's really a lot of big issues. But I'm like, oh, wait, I do feel like people might be able to gain more understanding and be more present and be able to listen more actively if they're just focusing on one of many topics, right? And so maybe having a conversation with a loved one, and maybe you start with one that is not the thing that you feel the most passionate about, right? Like start with a smaller one.
Right.
And maybe it's a series of conversations, or you just start by practicing with one thing, right? Or maybe it's the thing that you actually feel like perhaps you have the closest common ground on, like the climate or something else like that, right? And so, or maybe something that the two of you agree on, right? Like that we do agree that nature is important and we want to save our species and we have family in common and want our children to survive and be thriving. And so that just was interesting. Like, oh, right, one topic that probably really helped. It wasn't just this open forum of like, what are you the most concerned about? That could bring up a lot. And also being aware. Like it might be nice for you to reach out to the person that you're trying to have a conversation with and be like, hey, I would love to talk to you about gun reform, right? Like just that, so that they're not on guard thinking like, okay, we're going to have a conversation about all these things. But you can both come sort of aware of what the expectation is. I want to understand where you're coming from better and what you believe about it and why. And that I think could really help people. So interesting. Yeah.
I think it can help a few things. One is giving advance notice of the conversation always helps.
Yeah.
I would like to talk with you about gun reform whenever's good for you, right? Some people don't like to be surprised and forced into a conversation without their consent.
Of course, right.
Okay, so the advance warning is helpful. I'm going to refine your topic a little bit when I say I'd like to talk with you about gun reform. You're already showing your cards.
Yeah,
and
totally.
For the person, I don't believe in gun reform. I'm happy with the way guns are right now, so we have nothing to talk about. Make it broad and not tilted. If you were to look back at the posters and the topics we had of these makeshift coffee houses, they were neutral language. We want them to feel as comfortable for conservatives as for liberals. So try to state a topic in a neutral way. And a third thing is, if somebody goes off topic, don't hold it against them. It's fine to start with a topic. Hey, I'd like to talk with you about those signs on your lawn or something. But you know what? People can't help it.
Right. I experience that.
Yeah. And I'm guilty too. We all are. So just be careful not to use a topic as a way to enforce, your will or control, or you got to let people talk how they want about what they want, even if you did convene the meeting on a particular topic.
Totally. I love that. Yeah. So I do want to ask Craig, and I'm curious about this, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I am curious.
You have a lot of questions, Devin. It's great.
I do. I'm curious. We started this conversation saying that we both believe that disconnection leads to conflict, right? And connection leads to peace. And we're looking at an election a little bit over a month away. And I am curious if you have a sense of if one of these candidates, one of these parties has the capacity to bring more connection than the other. And in terms of our path forward, and more peace versus more conflict. So looking at it from that lens of connection, I am wondering what your thoughts are in terms of which party will be more effective in that regard.
Well, I'm a Democrat, and I'll be voting for Kamala Harris, and I think that she is talking a lot more about connection, and her track record shows that she has been a connector. Most, if not all, of Donald Trump's statements are about disconnecting. He seems in many respects to want to set us against each other. I find his comments to be mostly what's wrong and what's bad about a certain class of people or a certain person rather than what's good. And I tend to be a positive, idealistic person by nature. I'm naturally drawn to people who hope for the best. I think that Donald Trump seems to highlight the worst and, frankly, bring out the worst in people. And I find myself afraid if he were to become our president again, because to me, the evidence suggests that he is much more interested in tearing apart and tearing down civic institutions than he is about connecting us and building up our civic infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I've been feeling from the beginning that as soon as we found out that Trump was running again, that this is an election basically between connection and disconnection. And choosing Kamala is choosing a connected path forward. She is not perfect. Nobody is perfect. But I think that that path will lead more towards connection and move us in the direction that we need to go to heal, to take care of one another, and to take care of the planet, and to take care of all that needs to be taken care of, and will lead to more peace than the other path, which not only, for me, I not only feel will be destructive, I think it will be incredibly harmful and very disconnected. And so it's nice to hear you reinforce that belief. So thank you for that. So Craig, I just want to say thank you so much for coming, and I recommend that you all go to goodgroupdecisions.com. That link will be in the show notes and on the webpage to learn more about Craig. He has specifically shared with us his vast library of tools. It is vast. You can even search for keywords and things in there. So he has so many resources for you. And it is such a joy. I hope that this conversation helps you in having hard conversations, because connection is the healing path forward, including connecting with people that we don't necessarily agree with. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Connected Way. You can find all the resources mentioned in the show and even more resources in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com/podcast. Before you go, a note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and the work of The Connected Way, enhancing individual and collective connection to self, others, the land, and spirituality, you can donate on the podcast webpage. There is never any pressure or expectation, but if you feel called to support the work, any contribution of any amount helps, as do your good thoughts. And finally, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaway from today's show. What inspired you? What surprised you or made you think? Let me know by posting a comment on any of the posts or DMing me on Instagram, or of course, you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and the collective. And so it is. See you next time.